Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the California Institute of Integral Studies and to introduce to you our speaker tonight. Can you hear me okay? Microphone's working? Well, is this the amplifier microphone? Okay, so is this okay? Can you hear me this way? Does this have to be a little higher maybe? I don't know. Who's going to have a lavalier?
We have this. This is the house.
So in introducing,
If you hold that, then we'll tie it to him.
tie it to him. Okay. In introducing Colin Wilson, and I also, before I do that, I want to make an announcement that tapes of the talk will be available. You can order them in the break or right at the end for $7 each. There may be one or two tapes. And also, I believe, some books of his are also available. So this is the first time that Colin Wilson has been in California in 20 years. He is, without a doubt, one of the most prolific and versatile writers presently writing in the English language. I remember, just to tell you a personal note, that when I was an undergraduate student at Oxford University in the 50s, I remember quite distinctly when his book, The Outsider, exploded onto the London literary scene like a bombshell, and I remember reading stories about this literary wunderkind who was sleeping in a sleeping bag in Hampstead Heath and had produced this extraordinary book, The Outsider, a kind of a literary intellectual history of certain unusual genius figures in European history. And since that time, he's had a steady outpouring of books, both fiction and non-fiction. He's written a total of 17 novels and 44 non-fiction books, of quite an astonishing variety. And he's one of these interesting people who is totally uncontaminated with any academic training or institutional affiliation. And I'm happy to say that as somebody who's representing an academic institution. I welcome the freshness and aliveness of his perspective on the issues that we concern ourselves with. He's written no less than 3 books, possibly more that I don't know about, but I know at least 3 books of a sort of a biographical, intellectual biographies of leading psychologists, one about Maslow, New Pathways in Psychologies, one about Reich, The Quest for William Reich, another one about Jung, Lord of the Underworld. He's written books on the occult, the mysteries, the criminal history of mankind, a number of novels. My favorite among his novels is a book called The Mind Parasites, which is an occult novel about secret, unknown, destructive influences that work on the human psyche from within. A book that I personally regard as non-fiction rather than a novel, and that I definitely think deserves to be made into a film and maybe being made into a film at this time. Some of the titles of his other books I'll read from this recent collection of his writings: The Essential Colin Wilson, that's just appeared, The Outsider, The Religion and the Rebel, New Pathways in Psychology, I already mentioned, The New Existentialism, The Occult, Mysteries, Frankenstein's Castle. There's a provocative title of a paper called The Laurel and Hardy Theory of Consciousness, which if he doesn't talk about it, you should ask him what that is. A Criminal History of Mankind, The Man Parasites, The Black Room, The Philosopher's Stone, The World of Violence. He's had a long-standing interest in the kinds of topics that we at the California Institute of Integral Studies are also interested in: transpersonal psychology, peak experiences, new dimensions of consciousness. And he is known as a highly entertaining, versatile, and eloquent speaker. So without further ado, and with much great pleasure, I introduce to you Mr. Colin Wilson.
I unfortunately only have 3 or 4 hours in which to express the ideas I've been accumulating over the past 35 years, so if I gabble and sound incomprehensible, I hope you'll forgive me. I hope you'll forgive me for drinking water all the time too. Ever since I've been in America, I'm tremendously dehydrated. I live in Cornwall in England, you know, which is damp, and I need to drink gallons of water all the time in America. You may be right. Or positive ions or something of the sort. Anyway, as you know, I began by writing this book, The Outsider, which came out in 1956. My basic interest then was the problem of certain romantics of the 19th century who had experienced tremendous feelings of ecstasy and insight, and then wondered the next morning whether the whole thing was a total illusion, so that we got this tremendously high suicide rate among the romantics. Now, I was born into a working class family in Leicester in the Midlands in 1931, and I left school when I was 16 and immediately went to work in a factory. So I hated this background of, you know, work and dreary drudgery. I felt like a mouse on a treadmill, and this was, in a sense, the reason that I produced The Outsider. I felt that what I really wanted to do was to become a scientist at this time. Later I became much more interested in literature, but always I was obsessed by this idea of people who had had tremendous flashes of insight and then apparently lost them so completely that they'd felt suicidal. I'd always been preoccupied with this because I'd had the same kind of feelings ever since I was a small boy. And it wasn't until many years later when I read Wordsworth with his talk about, you know, this time in childhood when everything seems wonderful, and then how as you get older the shades of the prison house begin to close, that I began to see that this is a problem that all human beings experience. Fortunately, I didn't understand this in Leicester as a child, partly because I simply never met anybody who read a book. So I had a feeling, I suppose, of a uniqueness which was a great advantage. Anyway, years later, in the early 1950s, I was fascinated by a Frenchman called Alain Bombard, who sailed across the Atlantic in a tiny little rubber boat in order to prove that shipwrecked mariners did not have to die of thirst and starvation on the sea. What he wanted to prove was that you can drink small quantities of seawater, enough to stop yourself from getting dehydrated, and also that if you trail a kind of net behind the boat, you can catch enough plankton to actually eat plankton. And he also found that the juices of fishes do not contain salt. So if you catch fish and squash them and then drink the juice, this is something like water, except it has a nasty fishy taste. Anyway, halfway across the Atlantic, Bombard met a ship which stopped to ask him what he was doing, and he went on board and he had a normal meal of egg and bacon, and this almost killed him, because when he got back into his own little rubber dinghy and proceeded to sail across the Atlantic, he found that his stomach would no longer take the squashed fish and the plankton, and he vomited for days and almost died before his stomach readjusted. Now this struck me as a perfect symbol of the kind of thing that fascinated me, of, you know, the 19th century outsider who has these moments of ecstasy and then feels so completely bored and fed up when he gets back into ordinary consciousness that he just does not want to live anymore. So this was the basis of my first book. What I wanted to know was, is there some fundamental gap, as it were, between these moods of ecstasy and the ordinary reality of the physical world in which we live? Is it totally impossible to reconcile the two of them? In a sense, you see, I couldn't really believe that it was so, because whenever I experienced myself moods of intensity or of total relaxation, I always had the same insight, as if, I'd gone to a kind of hilltop and seen exactly and precisely the same vision, which made me feel that it was, in a sense, objective, and not, as, for example, Bertrand Russell said, something that just is completely subjective and imaginative. He loved quoting that story of somebody who'd had a mystical insight and tried to write it down. And the next morning when he looked at the piece of paper, it said something like, "There's a strong smell of petrol around here." And what fascinated me was that all of the mystics had said almost exactly the same thing about their mystical insights. In a book of mine called Mysteries, I quote the experience of a friend, a professor of music called Jerry Neff, who had taken an extremely pure form of LSD, and who described a kind of mystical experience under LSD, but who said that the trouble was that when he came back to Earth afterwards, he hated it so much that he just didn't want to continue living. This was obviously this basic problem of the Romantics. Now, it was a problem that I experienced throughout my teens, and yet I was fairly sure that this was not the real solution, to turn away completely from physical reality. Gurdjieff's disciple Ouspensky once wrote a chapter called Experimental Mysticism in a book called A New Model of the Universe. He claimed that fairly easily, much more easily than he'd expected, he was able to raise himself into states of mystical consciousness. He was able to do this before he met Gurdjieff. And I'm pretty certain, in a sense, I know how he set about doing it. The main problem with all of us, although we don't even notice this normally, is that we leak. We leak energy the whole time, almost as if you were going around with your wrists slashed, bleeding. The external world continually sucks energy from you, and any kind of problem, anything that causes that slight sinking of the stomach, that feeling of, oh God, no, is actually sucking energy from you like a vampire. So we're almost completely unaccustomed to moods in which this is not true, in which, we suddenly experience a strange inner feeling of pressure. That's the answer. Pressure. Inner pressure. And I'm pretty sure that all Ouspensky did was teach himself the trick of closing his leaks in the way that you do whenever you become deeply absorbed in anything at all. Hermann Hesse says in The Journey to the East that, he says, as the musician of the party, he got used to the fact that whenever he concentrated upon minor things, unimportant things, but concentrated his total attention on them, it had the strange effect of raising his vitality and filling him with new life. Everybody's done that when you're feeling low and bored, and suddenly anything you concentrate upon closes the leaks. Ouspensky said that when he did this, almost immediately he passed in to a realm of consciousness in which everything became inexpressible almost immediately. He said words simply vanished. You could no longer use words because the impressions and insights were flying past you at such a speed that language instantly became useless. Do you remember that William James said the same kind of thing? I was telling Ralph earlier this evening that in the 1960s he'd sent me a copy of that psychedelic review with William James's essay called Some Notes About Mysticism, and that William James had said that he was convinced that mystical experiences are not, in any basic sense, different from getting drunk, that they do have something in common. But then he went on to say that he himself had had just 3 or 4 mystical experiences in the course of his life. And he described one of these in this way. He said that some friend said something to him that suddenly reminded him of something else. And that reminded him of something else, and that reminded him of something else, and that reminded him of something else. And he said, like a flash of lightning, zigzagging out to a kind of distant horizon, he suddenly experienced this tremendous sense which almost instantly left language behind. And the interesting point he made was that he talked about distant horizons of fact. Not distant horizons of mystical awareness, but fact, ordinary, common sense fact. Now, one of the things that Ouspensky said was that language vanished almost immediately because it was all happening too quickly for consciousness to keep up with it. And secondly, that there was suddenly this extraordinary sense of things which we take for granted turning themselves completely inside out. All mystics, for example, say without exception that space and time are seen to be illusions. Now, this is obviously absurd. I mean, you know, space is quite obviously real as we're sitting here, and as for time, how can time possibly be an illusion? For example, something which has not yet happened has not yet happened, and that's all there is to it. It may happen one way, it may happen another. And yet, there are thousands and thousands of examples of people who have seen with total precision something which is going to happen to them. Impossible. A friend of mine, returning from a concert late at night in which he'd been playing, was convinced as he drove along the Bayswater Road north of Hyde Park that at the next Queensway turning, a taxi would come across the road and hit his taxi side on. And he felt a bit embarrassed about telling the driver of his own taxi, you know, about this premonition. And yet, you know, at the Queensway turning, another taxi came out and hit his taxi sideways on, and he knew this something like 2 minutes before it happened. Preposterous. Yet, believe me, you know, it happens all the time. The evidence for precognition is enormous, which means that in some absurd sense, either everything which is going to happen has already happened, or that time is scrambled in some completely incomprehensible way which we cannot even begin to grasp. Ouspensky said that in these peculiar mystical experiences, the gap between words in the sentence became enormous. He said, incidentally, that ordinary time continued to exist. It didn't disappear at all. And he later came to the conclusion that, in fact, time has 3 distinct dimensions. But he said ordinary time continued to exist. The only thing was that if he started a sentence, between the first and the second word in the sentence, he saw so many different implications of what he was saying that it became incredibly difficult to reach the third word. And in between the second and the third word, once again, so many millions of implications, so much excitement about... He gives, I think, an example, like saying to someone, what time is it or something? And the word what already raised immense questions. The word time almost completely stopped him from thinking, and then the word is once again raised thousands of other implications, so that he could hardly continue the sentence. And he said, you know, he just couldn't finish the sentence anyhow, because there was too much to say. Ouspensky said some other very odd things about mystical experience. One of the things he said, the most basic thing, was that it was almost impossible to say anything because in order to say anything, you had to say everything. Everything, he said, was connected. There was no more separation. Everything was connected together. So that if you started to try and say something, you got lost in the fact that it was connected to everything else. He also said that when, after these experiences, he came back to Earth, so to speak, he said it was a hateful experience. He said you came down into a wooden world with wooden thoughts, and wooden feelings, as if everything was grinding like some enormously slow mill wheel. This, in itself fascinated me because, obviously, Rudolf Steiner once said, "Never complain about your lot in life because you chose it before you were born." Why on earth should we choose to live in a wooden universe? Gurdjieff once said that this universe we live in is the equivalent of outer Siberia. And when I was reading Uspensky, this came to me with tremendous clarity, that he'd said something absolutely fundamental. This business of the wooden world that we live in. And the question came to me, in that case, why? Why do we live in this wooden world if it is our choice? If we have any kind of choice at all? And the answer came to me in a kind of flash. Because the stakes are so tremendously high. We have, in a sense, more opportunity to do things living in this wooden world than we would ever have up there in these peculiar mystical regions in which everything is seen to be superb, ecstatically wonderful. Uspensky also said that one of the problems of mystical experience was that our nice, clear division between subjective and objective ceased to exist. He said the subjective was always suddenly becoming the objective, and the objective was always becoming the subjective. Not completely and entirely, but in small things. They just changed places. Again, you see, we just cannot even begin to grasp this. Why can't we grasp it? Because we are living in a wooden world in which everything is totally separate. Why is it totally separate? Because, in a certain sense, we can handle this wooden world. We can handle it, for example, with language. The human race has quite deliberately pushed out little by little into this realm of language until it can actually begin to handle all kinds of abstractions. Do you realize that if Voltaire was now sitting in this audience, he wouldn't understand a single word I am saying, in spite of the fact that he's enormously intelligent? Why? Because we've already pushed our language out into that darkness of the unknown just a few inches further than Voltaire had. We're already moving into a new area of concepts. And this is the thing that really fascinates me. When I ask myself, okay, we're in a wooden world in which everything is separate and in which we are continually losing direction. That's the essential thing about human beings. We're always losing all sense of direction. It's like those games you play at children's parties, where you put a blindfold around somebody and turn them around 20 times and then push them off, to play blind man's buff. We're always in this situation. I find myself continually getting a sudden brilliant insight and then losing the bloody thing 5 minutes later. And my mind is fairly good. I spend my life trying to grasp insights. This is our problem. And I'll give you an example of this. A few years ago, I was driving back from Plymouth, which is our local town in Cornwall. In fact, you've probably heard of it. And I was coming back from a television station fairly late at night, and I was feeling rather fed up with I'm a typical home bird. I'm a cancer. I detest travel. And this is why, I haven't been to America in 20 years. Tell you why I'm in America, incidentally. Ralph White in New York actually managed to get hold of me in some hotel in Japan just as I was leaving the hotel. The manager said there's a call from New York, and I said, impossible, nobody knows I'm here. I went in and took it, and indeed, he'd tracked me down all over the world by actually getting onto my secretary and finding out all of the places I'd been in, and I thought, there's some peculiar meaning in this. I better go to America. Now, I haven't yet discovered what this meaning is. I was coming back from Plymouth, and I was feeling fed up and bored with the fact that I was being forced to drive back late at night when I'd rather be sitting in my armchair drinking wine. And halfway back I wanted to pee. So I turned into a little side turning off the main road and had my pee, and then had to back onto the main road, which was perfectly safe because, you know, you could see car headlights for miles. Unfortunately, I had no very good rear light, and I couldn't see precisely where the main road is, and I turned a little before that and backed onto a sort of muddy shoulder on the corner of the main road. And when I tried to go forward again, my back wheels spun and dug in. I found myself thinking, oh my God, what a bore. Anyway, I got out of the car, looked in the boot to see if I'd got blankets or anything to put under them. I hadn't. And I thought, you know, well, okay, so I walked 3 or 4 miles to the next AA box and ring up and so on. Then I decided I would try, instead of trying to go forward, backing further onto it, which seemed a stupid and dangerous thing to do, but anyway, it worked. I managed to back further onto it, then with a sudden burst of energy, shot onto the road. And of course, I drove back in a state of total euphoria. And this... But it struck me as significant. I'd recognized something in a flash as I got off that shoulder, and I could not put my finger on it. Now, I forgot about that until the next time I was driving to Plymouth, maybe 6 months later. And then, once again, I thought, what was it I saw? I tried hard to pin it down and couldn't. Once again, another 6 months later, I went past the same spot, and this time I really tried hard, and this time I got it. And fortunately, I had a tape recorder in the car. I put it down on the tape recorder. And then I forgot it. And 6 months later, passing the place again, I thought, what was it I saw? Now, luckily, I remembered that it was on tape somewhere. I went through all my tapes, one by one, and I finally found it 2 years after the original experience. And what I said on the tape was this. And I think it is a genuine insight. In fact, I think it's, you know, one of my best insights. That's the thing I'm good at, turning intuitions into words. What I'd said was this. We appear to have 3 systems of values. One is physical. We're all used to this fact that our physical values change from minute to minute. You can feel wonderful at 9 o'clock in the morning and absolutely rotten by 10 o'clock just because you're hungry or you've got a headache or something of the sort. We're all used to these physical values, and they don't worry us. We're more or less used to that. But then next up the ladder are emotional values. And emotional values are also pretty changeable, but not nearly as changeable as the physical values. Sort of jealousy and envy and all this kind of thing are fairly strong, but they don't affect us all that often. They do nevertheless cause life to be sort of rather like this. Not like physical values, which make life like this, but, you know, sort of... Then finally there are our intellectual values, which are on top. And they do their best on the whole to tell you the truth. When you're sort of losing your temper or getting miserable or something, your intellectual values tell you you're being a bloody fool, and on the whole you know they're right. They may, in fact, make you just irritable by telling you this, but nevertheless, you know they're telling you the truth. They really do their best. And they continue more or less almost on a straight, flat level. Now, the physical values don't matter. What does matter are these other 2 sets of values. The intellect should be on top, and the emotional values should be underneath. And when that happens, when you're in these states of relaxation and happiness, you get this strange feeling as if you are standing on a hilltop and your emotions are perfectly within your control, and you have this strange feeling that all is well. Now, what tends to happen, unfortunately, is that they tend to turn upside down. The emotional values get on top and the intellectual values get underneath. You could almost turn it into a kind of Confucian parable and say that when the intellect is emperor and the emotions are the grand vizier, then the country is serene and perfectly adjusted. That when the Grand Vizier, the emotions, usurp the throne and turn the intellect into the servant, then quite suddenly the whole country is misery and chaos and confusion. For example, you know how often you've met people who actually are upside-downers. It's almost, as if your feet turned into balloons and went into the air and your head is down there. Sort of idiots who allow their emotions to dominate their lives completely and what's more, justify them with the intellect. And you know that these bastards are the most dangerous people of all. Now, this came to me, and I put it on tape, and even so I forgot it. And it was only when I managed to find the tape that I suddenly saw that this was one of the most important insights of my life. We lose things so quickly, and this is our fundamental problem. Now, as you know, after The Outsider came out, I became fascinated by the work of Abraham Maslow, who wrote to me saying that he'd read a book of mine called The Stature of Man, and he was fascinated by my assertion that in the 20th century, most human beings are subject to what I called the fallacy of insignificance, the feeling that they don't matter. Maslow said to me that he had once said to his students, "Which among you thinks you will become great?" And they just looked at him blankly. And he said, "If not you, who then?" And they'd suddenly seen his point. Somebody has to do it. Maslow also told me in this same letter that he'd got fascinated by healthy people because, he said, healthy people never bother to talk about their health, whereas sick people talk about their sickness all the time. And he thought, there was something to be learned about healthy people by studying them. So he said he asked among his friends, "Who's the healthiest person you know?" And they quickly put him onto friends they felt were exceptionally healthy. And by studying these healthy people, he discovered something that nobody else had ever discovered before, because nobody had ever thought of studying healthy people. And that is that healthy people all had, with a great degree of frequency, what Maslow called peak experiences, these bubbling experiences of sheer overwhelming happiness. He said, for example, that a young mother was watching her husband and children eating breakfast when a beam of sunlight came in through the window, and she suddenly thought, "My God, aren't I lucky?" and went into the peak experience. He said that a Marine who'd spent several years in the Pacific without seeing a woman, when he went back to base and saw a nurse, immediately had a peak experience because he noticed that women are quite different from men. Now, I said to Maslow, "My God, this is tremendous." I actually went to lecture at Brandeis University where Maslow was. You really hit upon something of terrific importance here. I've been writing about all these romantic outsiders of the 19th century who had these wonderful peak experiences, and then the morning after felt that the whole world was dreary and boring, and that the whole thing was an illusion. Van Gogh painting that picture, The Starry Night, with a wonderful sky exploding into stars, and then committing suicide and leaving a note saying, "Misery will never end." This is the problem with the great outsiders, that they were subject to these tremendous changes of viewpoint, and they could not decide which of the two was the truth. This is obviously the basic problem. Maslow was saying that his healthy people kept having these insights in which they said, "My God, yes! The intensity experience is the truth, and the boredom is in some way a lie." Anyway, Maslow said, "Well, yes, I agree with you, but the only trouble is you can't make it come and go at will. Peak experiences come when they want to, and they go when they want to, and there's nothing you can do about it." Now, this got me into a state of frenzied excitement. I said, "Look, this cannot be true. If what you are saying is true, and men are not helpless, hopeless slaves of their environment, If in fact healthy people, because they're highly motivated, have peak experiences all the time, then it must be possible to create the peak experience at will. And Maslow said, no, it's not. But, in fact, in a sense, Maslow had contradicted himself, because he found that when he talked to his students about peak experiences, they began remembering peak experiences which they'd had in the past and which they'd now more or less forgotten about. They kind of take them for granted, as we all take happiness for granted as a pleasant experience, which you then forget, as if, you know, you're not really due for it. Maslow found that, for example, one of his students was drumming his way through college as a jazz drummer to make money. And one night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, he suddenly began to drum so perfectly that he couldn't do a thing wrong. And he went into the peak experience. And other students began to talk about similar peak experiences. The interesting thing is that as soon as they began to talk about peak experiences, they began having peak experiences all the time. It was merely a question of turning the mind in that direction. As soon as, in other words, they began to see instinctively and intuitively the mechanism of the peak experience, they knew how to do it. So in point of fact, in a basic sense, we are all capable of having peak experience whenever we want to. Anyway, I was asked to write a book about Maslow, and I was fortunate in that I got all this stuff from him just about a year before he died. He died of a heart attack in 1970. I did this book, New Pathways in Psychology, about him, and I felt this was a tremendous advance, because I was arguing throughout the book for the notion that human beings are capable of controlling their own destiny, are capable of controlling their own mental states, and that we can do this to some extent, not even by needing drugs like my friend Jerry Neff, or alcohol, but can do it almost by pure reason alone. This was the really extraordinary idea. And then, at about this time, I came upon what I thought to be the second tremendous advance. When I learned about split brain physiology. Now, all of you know all about this, and I know it's a bit of a bore to talk about it, but just for the benefit of anyone who doesn't, I'll quickly summarize the basic facts. As you know, in the 19th century, they already knew that the two halves of the brain appear to have two completely different functions. That the right half of the brain seems to be associated with pattern recognition, so that, for example, a musician who had right brain damage was just no longer able to compose. And yet he would remain perfectly normally articulate, could talk in an ordinary way, and you wouldn't know there was anything wrong with him. People who'd had left brain damage can no longer speak at all clearly, but on the other hand, they're still capable, let's say, of being artists. So obviously the left brain was connected with reason and logic and language, and the right brain with pattern recognition and intuition, you know. If you took off the top of your head, the top of your brain looks like a walnut, joined by a big knot of nerves in the middle called the corpus callosum. They quickly discovered that if you sever the corpus callosum, people turn into two completely different people. The interesting thing that was soon discovered was that it is the person in the left hemisphere that you call you, and that the person living over in the right appears to be a total stranger. For example, if you show a patient an orange with the right eye, which is connected to the left brain, and you show the patient an apple with the left eye, and you see, you say to them, what have you just seen? They reply, an orange. If you say, write with your left hand what you've just seen, they write apple. If you say, what have you just written? They say, orange. If you show the patient a dirty picture with the right brain, they blush. If you say, why are you blushing? They say, I don't know. You've got two people living in your heads, and the one living on the left side is you. The person living on the other side is a total stranger. Now, I had always known this instinctively anyway, because as a writer, You're aware that the two halves of your brain are interacting continually to produce your writing. So when you're young, you get these marvelous intuitions and ideas, you write them down, and the next morning you think, my God, that was a masterpiece, and then you read it and it's horrible. It's sort of like squashed flies on the paper. And you just get that feeling that in turning things into words, you completely destroy them. You get the feeling, that maybe it is impossible, that there's something completely incompatible between inspiration and language. But if you're a writer, you persist anyway because, there's nothing else to do. And then suddenly, one day, you look at what you wrote the night before and it's still there. You've caught it. It's like putting a scent into a bottle and putting in a glass stopper, and it's still there the next morning. And you suddenly have this terrific feeling of triumph. Words can do it. And as soon as you know this, you begin doing it with more confidence. And you're aware that what happens is that the ideas, the intuitions come surging into your mind, and you, the left brain, catch them and turn them into words. And if you do it very well, the right brain says, yes, that's what I meant. And the left brain says, oh, really? Thank you very much. And catches the next lot even better and turns that into words even better. And suddenly you've got a superb tennis match going between the two halves of the brain. It's almost as if the right and the left were like two lumberjacks at either end of a double-handed saw, and they must work together. And as soon as you begin to recognize this curious relation between the two halves, you realize that in a sense, you've always known this. For example, do you remember that game that you played as a child when you kind of stand stiff like this and then you fall backwards into the arms of someone who's waiting behind you to catch you, and you never really dare fall because you're always afraid they'll back away and let you fall on your back? But the point is that when you get used to this peculiar relation between the two halves of the brain, you know that the right brain will always catch you, that you can rely on it absolutely and totally. The trouble is we're stuck in the left, and we're stuck therefore in this tense, miserable, overstressed state of mind without recognizing that 2 centimeters away we have this incredible ally who is perfectly willing to do anything for us. Now, this is what I called, and Ralph said I should mention this, the Laurel and Hardy theory of consciousness. Because the two halves of the brain are exactly like Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy. The left brain is Ollie, that's the you, the logical language side. And on the other side, there's Stan, who is intuitive and in some ways stupid, and yet he's in charge of your energy supply. And if Stan gets miserable and discouraged, you go, ah, and feel a total lack of drive and energy. So, what happens is that Ollie wakes up, let's say, on a Monday morning, and he looks out of the window and says, oh God, Monday and it's raining. Now the trouble is Stan always exaggerates. And Stan overhears this and says, oh God, Monday and it's raining. And of course he fails to send up this sort of burst of energy, which, you notice, is the peak experience. It's Stan who sends up the peak experiences, that sudden flooding of delight. And then, of course, Ollie, sort of, because he's rather bored and fed up, cuts himself while shaving and splashes coffee all over the table and trips over the doorstep on his way out of the house. And each time he says, oh, God, it's one of those days. And each time Stan overhears and says, oh, God, it's one of those days. And the result is that, by the time Ollie's got to work, he's in a total state of misery. On the other hand, when you are happy, let's say a child on Christmas morning wakes up and thinks, marvellous, it's Christmas. And Stan overhears and says, marvellous, it's Christmas. And sends up a flood of energy. And then, everything reinforces this original happiness. The lights on the Christmas tree, the smell of cooking mince pies, the Christmas music coming from the radio and so on. And everything makes him feel happier and happier until all the leaks are closed. And by midday, he's in an ecstatic state of happiness in which he feels the whole world is self-evidently wonderful and cannot understand how halfway through the year he could possibly be feeling bored and miserable. Because that's the real problem. Now, when we get this feedback between Stan and Ollie, what I call positive feedback, although, electronically speaking, this is not accurate. When we get the positive feedback between Stan and Ollie, we get these curiously happy states in which you begin to close your leaks. And as soon as you begin to close your leaks, your inner pressure rises. As I say, we're like tires with lots of little punctures in us normally, and somehow, whenever you begin to experience happiness, you get that interested feeling which makes you close the leaks. And as soon as you do that, up goes your inner pressure, and suddenly you begin to move into completely new areas of consciousness. And it's purely a matter of closing these leaks, of stopping bleeding gouts of blood as you walk around. As simple as that. Anything that causes intense concentration will do this. You remember Dr. Johnson saying, the knowledge that he's to be hanged in a fortnight concentrates a man's mind wonderfully. Now, what interested me so much about the Stan and Ollie theory of consciousness is that obviously we are normally trapped in the left brain, and that as soon as we really begin to relax, we move, so to speak, into the middle. Now, what struck me as most curious was that split brain patients, and they split the brain sometimes to prevent people from having epileptic attacks. It stops the electrical storm from moving from one side to the other. Split brain patients appeared to be totally unchanged. They couldn't see any difference in them whatsoever, until they began to notice, that if a split brain patient bashed into a table with the right side of his body, he didn't notice that he'd done himself any damage. And they suddenly realized that this was the real problem, that you're turning people into two people. But Mozart once said that tunes were always walking into his head completely unannounced and fully fledged. What he meant, of course, was they were walking into the left brain. And where were they coming from? The right. Mozart was a split brain patient. And if Mozart was a split brain patient, then certainly we all are. Here we have a fundamental clue. Obviously the problem lies in this something inside the head. Move your identity towards the center, and you begin to get this strange feeling of unknown realms which are accessible to you. Whereas the more tense and miserable you get, the more you seem to lose contact with any kind of inner powers inside you. Now obviously, most of us spend an enormous amount of our time in these states of tension and misery and so on, of total loss of contact with anything inside us. So obviously, one immensely important thing to know is that you have Stan over there perfectly willing to send up energy. All you have to do is to look cheerful. You see, this is all Maslow's students did. I mean, can you see that? That as soon as they began talking to one another about peak experiences and saying, yes, yes, I remember that, they began having peak experiences all the time. Why? Because the Stan inside their heads listened to these talk about peak experiences and got all cheerful and began sending up lots of energy. And as soon as you have this lots of energy, you have peak experiences all the time. So in a certain sense, it's an absolutely straightforward, logical thing. If you can actually convince Stan that the world is wonderful, then everything is fine. You see, I learned this the very, very hard way. In 1973, I started to have an appalling series of panic attacks at a time when I was overworked. Well, what happened was this. I was asked to contribute to a series of magazines that would be bound up as a part work. It was on crime, and I was one of the editors of the series, but I was also the one who, in every issue, had to write the main article on whatever crime the issue dealt with. So if it was kidnapping, I had to write a history of kidnapping. If it was sex murder, I had to write a history of sex murder, and so on. And we talked for 2 years about this, and nothing happened. And then suddenly, it was bought by an American publisher, and the English publisher said, "Okay, we're off. Can you deliver 7 articles per week of 3,000 words each?" Well, you know, this meant writing from something like 8 o'clock in the morning and, you know, turning out a 12-page piece, and also doing the research. Well, I knew a lot of it, so it wasn't too difficult. Anyway, after a week or 2 of this, he rang me and said, "Look, can you make it 10 articles per week?" And, you know, now I was producing 30,000 words a week. It meant doing a full 12-page article in the morning, and then in the afternoon doing half another article, and then settling down doing half that the next morning, and another full 12-page article in the afternoon. Well, oddly enough, you know, I'm a hard worker and I'm fairly cheerful, and I was doing this quite well. And in the middle of all this, 2 bloody Canadian journalists came to see me, and they were very young and very full of enthusiasm, and they talked until 2 in the morning. I went off to bed sort of a bit hungover because we were drinking wine, and they came again the next day and did it a second time to me. And it was this time that at about 4 o'clock in the morning I woke up with my head throbbing, and I suddenly began to think about all the work that I got to do the next day. And I began to go into a kind of state of tension, and I thought, oh my God, perhaps I ought to go down and stop working now. You know, if in the middle of the night you get these silly ideas. And I thought, God, if I do that, I'm really round the bend. And I told myself just to lie still and relax. And then I made a mistake. I tried to do what I'd often done before, to solve the problem by sheer willing, by sheer concentration. I began to do this and experienced a sort of sinking feeling as I did it. And quite suddenly my face began to burn, and my fingertips began to burn, and my heart began to go at such a tremendous pace that I thought I was having a heart attack. So I rushed out to the lavatory, and I just sat there on the lavatory, letting myself get cold, and kind of soothing myself as you would soothe a frightened horse. And after something like half an hour, I felt well enough to go and get back into bed. But as soon as I got back into bed, it started again, this awful pounding of the heart. And I got out of bed this time, went to the sitting room, put the lights on, and I sat there thinking, what's wrong? Because I couldn't understand. I've always been a very happy, cheerful sort of character, and here I was suddenly feeling as if immense depths were opening under my feet. I'd written this novel, The Mind Parasites, about sort of parasites that get into the depths of the unconscious mind and drain our energies like vampires. And I suddenly began to wonder whether, you know, I'd been writing about something real. Anyway, I went back to bed at about 6 in the morning, feeling absolutely low and tired. I managed to get to sleep by simply staring at the window and not letting my thoughts move in the least in either direction, just as it were freezing myself dead. And I fell asleep. But when I woke up, of course, I was exhausted and so on. And throughout the rest of that day, I was dragging a feeling of misery, you know, as if some great catastrophe had occurred and kept recurring to my mind. I actually went and wrote it straight down, and that account is at the beginning of my book, Mysteries. And I found that writing it down made a big difference. I felt much, much better, but even so, towards evening, I began to experience this same doubt and panic. Now, I learned gradually to control this. I learned that when I woke up in the middle of the night feeling this sudden feeling of panic coming on, this worry, oh my God, it's going to happen again, which of course makes it happen again, all I had to do was to wake myself up as fully as I possibly could. I had to really shake myself awake instead of lying there in this midway state. And as soon as I woke myself up fully, it was as if a schoolmistress had come into a room full of quarrelling children and sort of like that, an instant silence. I called this the schoolmistress effect, and I quickly learned to do it when I woke up feeling awful at 4 o'clock in the morning. But the interesting thing was that I realized during the day, I would be going up and down like an aeroplane. It's so easy to go into these nosedives of total depression, particularly when you're tired. I found myself going into this nosedive, and normally we let ourselves go into the nosedive. We just feel it's inevitable. Someone told me just yesterday that he'd, the evening before, just gone into a nosedive of total depression. He said he sat staring at the wall for 2 hours before it went away. And that's what you tend to do. You tend to feel it's inevitable, and you just do it, stare at the wall and wait for it to go away. Now, what was happening with me was that the nosedive became so serious that you felt the plane would hit the ground, and that if that happened, you'd be permanently mentally destroyed. And so, I was suddenly forced to make an effort of will, and I would start, as it were, to call upon my vital powers, and I'd get the plane out of the dive, and up I would go again. And always a terrific feeling of triumph. And then, of course, you relax, and half an hour later, down again. And once again, you begin to feel this panic, and once again make the mental effort, and once again get it going up. And that's just a fascinating and very strange experience. You suddenly realize that you could do it. That when you went into the nosedive, you could pull out of it and pull up. And each time you pulled out of it and pulled up, you had this strange feeling of triumph. You knew that Maslow was wrong when he said, we cannot induce the peak experience at will. The only reason we can't induce it is because we're too lazy. We go into these dives and stay in them. We're too passive. Now, what I began to realize from these panic attacks was that, in fact, we have an enormous control over ourselves which we do not normally bother to exercise. And this was the real lesson of them. I'd sometimes walk out on the cliffs, as I do with my dogs every afternoon for a walk. And I'd be in this curious situation of feeling totally low and depressed, whereas intellectually speaking, when I'd thought this out, I'd be thinking, so to speak, totally optimistic. And I'd be in this strange state, like walking along the street with, sunlight halfway down the street and total shadow on the other side. An absurd state, and yet recognizing that I was almost two people. And as soon as I began to get used to this, I began to realize that if I really put, so to speak, my whole weight on the sunlit side, that is, I began to deliberately use my will, I could little by little completely vanquish that other person inside me. And you can see what I'm talking about, just what I was saying earlier about upside downness. When I was wandering over the cliffs in this state of depression, I was upside down. My feet were up in the air and my head was down there. What I gradually learned to do was by kind of struggling hopelessly, and it is a hopeless struggle. You feel like a diver, in the depths of the sea with no gravity, was struggling to get back the right way up. And it often happened in a flash, quite suddenly. In fact, the experience that really showed me that I'd done it was one day when I was supposed to write 3 books, one after the other. I'd committed myself to this stupid schedule, and I'd written off to one publisher. I was doing a novel for Reader's Digest about Rasputin. I was doing a book on witchcraft, and I was doing a book about the poltergeist. I wrote to the publisher of Poltergeist and said, look, I can't deliver until November. Is that okay? I was supposed to deliver by July the 1st. And usually publishers say, okay, take it for granted. But he wrote back saying, no, I'm awfully sorry. We've got to have it by July the 1st. We've got the printers ready to start printing then. He said, if you like, you can do 3/4 of the book and deliver the rest a week later, but we've got to have the first session by July the 1st. Anyway, I went downstairs to work on the book on witchcraft, and there I was writing some miserable piece about, women being tortured to death and children burned and all the rest of it. And at a certain point, I needed a particular reference. And when you're tired, you just don't want to go and check. You think, oh, well, sling it in and I'll look later, or nobody will notice anyway. And then being conscientious, I thought, no, let's go and check it. So with a groan, I dragged myself upstairs, and I've got a kind of library shed outside. I've got 30,000 books around in my house, and some of them were in an outside library, and I went and looked through the books, and I could not find the reference I wanted. And suddenly, in that outside library, I began experiencing this incredible depression, and the sudden feeling that, this could be it. This could be the point where I went below a certain line and stayed permanently below it. And I still dragged myself out to the hall of the house where I knew I'd got other books on witchcraft, and I found the reference. I went downstairs now with a terrifically heavy feeling inside me, a feeling of panic. And as I sat down in my armchair and to start writing, it was really a terrific internal weight, a fear that this time my mind would snap. And then I bent down to pick up something from the floor, and that act somehow broke it. And quite suddenly the whole thing just vanished. I was feeling absolutely superb and normal. I don't know why, it was just that bending down of something that did it. And I suddenly knew that I'd got it beaten, that whatever had been trying to oppress me and oppress me and oppress me had suddenly decided it wasn't worth it anymore, had just gone away. And from that point onwards, I knew that it could always be beaten. Now, the absurdity was this recognition of being two people, of having one side trying to drag you down, and the other side determined not to be dragged down. And I could see that the basic problem with us as human beings is that we find it incredibly difficult to trust to our reason. When the emotions begin to drag you down, you just automatically feel that the best thing to do is to let them drag you down, and maybe you'll feel better tomorrow morning. So we just get into this habit of not fighting, of always giving way. We're sort of like an occupied country, occupied by the Nazis or something, who have just learned to keep our heads down and not contradict. And the sudden realization that you can contradict, and that if you do it hard enough, you suddenly begin to win, was an incredible insight. You see, this for me was a far bigger problem than just a personal problem. People like Sartre and Camus and Hemingway and all of the major writers of the 20th century had been saying that life is ultimately futile and meaningless. Sartre said it is meaningless that we live and meaningless that we die. Man is a useless passion. Camus said that life can be compared to Sisyphus pushing a rock uphill and then watching it roll down again to the bottom. Hemingway says in The Old Man and the Sea, a man can be destroyed but not defeated, but nevertheless, you know, he admits he can be destroyed. And all he can do is just fight against this power which is bigger than he is. All the major writers of the 20th century have been saying this. And this is what I was writing about in that book, The Age of Defeat, which is called, in America, The Stature of Man, because the Americans wanted an upbeat title. And which caused Maslow to write to me in the first place. This feeling that we're living in a basically pessimistic culture, that when our kids go to school and high school and university, we're ramming this pessimistic shit down their throats. They're learning it in their literary classes, their philosophy classes, and all the rest of it. Can we wonder that we're creating a civilization with a basically pessimistic bias? Maslow was the first person to see clearly that this does not have to be so. But by saying that you cannot create peak experiences at will, he'd failed to see through to the depths of his own theory. Now, Sartre said that what he called nausea, meaning by that sudden feeling of, oh God, no, the basic feeling that matter, it overwhelms us completely. I get it all the time when I'm traveling. That sudden feeling that we are living in a world of meaningless objects is the ultimate truth of human existence. Sartre said nausea is the fundamental basis of consciousness. And this is something that had always fascinated me. Camus, whom I knew, said the same thing. Camus says in The Myth of Sisyphus that suddenly what he calls the absurd, meaning by that nausea, suddenly strikes out of the blue and makes you suddenly see that life is really meaningless. You know, he says something like, you go to work every day, morning, you travel back for lunch, you go back in the afternoon, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. He said, and then suddenly the great question, why, hits you. Why am I doing this bloody boring stuff? What am I doing here? And he claims that this is the sudden recognition of the basic truth about human existence, which he calls the absurd. He says this suddenly strikes you if you watch a man in a telephone booth making a call, and his face distorted with emotion, and yet you can't hear a word he's saying. You can just see him gesturing and maybe even crying. And he said, you know, this suddenly reveals to you the basic absurdity of human existence. Now, this in itself struck me as a simple logical error. If you turn down the sound of the television set, you get exactly the same effect. The people are doing all kinds of things on the TV. You cannot understand what they're really doing, and yet you know that that is because you have deprived reality of a dimension of meaning by turning down the sound. You haven't reduced it to some fundamental truth. You just turn down the sound. You see, put it this way. Imagine that ordinary consciousness is like a billiard table with the billiard balls scattered all over its surface. Now, that is when you are bored and tired. That is what Sartre called nausea. As soon as you become interested in something, you automatically draw the billiard balls towards the center of the table. You do it quite automatically. You merely have to say, you know, oh, isn't that interesting? And instantly, Stan sends up the energy and the billiard balls move into the center of the table. Now, when you become deeply interested in something, it's almost as if the billiard balls are now pressing together so hard they begin to climb in two ranks or tiers. And you suddenly know that if you've got to really maintain that concentration, what Shaw calls in Heartbreak House the 7th degree of concentration, you can make the billiard balls climb up into a 3rd tier and then a 4th tier and then a 5th tier until you've got a pyramid of billiard balls. In fact, that doesn't normally happen to us because long before we got that far, we just let go and they go all over the tabletop again. But you can suddenly see, when you've got them into more than one tier, that that is the answer. You're suddenly seeing the meaning that's being exuded by things around us. And as soon as you see meaning, you somehow reach out to it, putting out a kind of deep vital energy which comes from Stan, and you realize that if you could get beyond a certain point of intensity, you would never collapse, because it's so enjoyable having 2 or 3 rows on top of one another that you would never let them go. And that we're all capable of this. This is one of the things that William James observed in that essay, The Energies of Man, where he says that we all know that on certain days we experience far more feeling of vitality than on others, and that we don't appear to be able to control this. There are certain days when our energies just seem to be blocked, when nothing seems to come through, when we just feel a lower level of vitality than usual. And yet there are other days in which we feel peculiarly energetic and vital. And that it is quite obvious that we can somehow build up our energies to these higher levels. And then James goes on to cite cases of people who under crisis have done this kind of thing. He says, for example, that during the Indian Mutiny of the 1850s, when a town was surrounded by Indian rebels and the colonel in charge knew that if the rebels got in, every woman and child would be horribly tortured to death, he lived for days and days and days without any sleep whatever and without any food. He lived on brandy, and yet he never got drunk. He was in at such a state of intensity with so many of the billiard balls on top of one another that he never got drunk until they'd got rid of the rebels. Then you can relax and let yourself go. And James said it is always these sudden crises that cause us to do this. And suddenly I knew that I was onto something absolutely fundamental. I realized that always, when I'd done this, it had been through sudden crises. For example, in 1963, my wife and I were driving down from Leicester, my hometown, back to Cornwall, where I live. And I was pretty tired because my dad had taken me out to all the pubs in Leicester at lunchtime, and I was feeling, sort of rather heavy and stupid. And as we were driving back, I was thinking that in Cheltenham, there's a good second-hand bookstore, and I meant to have a good wander around there and cheer myself up by buying some second-hand books. We stopped a few yards from the store at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I took my little daughter, who was then 3 years old, into the shop with me, while my wife stayed outside clearing out the boot of the car to make room for the second-hand books we were going to purchase. After a few minutes, my daughter got bored and said, "Where's Mummy?" So I took her to the door of the shop and I showed her where Joy was, only, as far away as the corner over there. And she trotted off to her. I went back into the shop. I stood there looking at books for another 10 minutes. Then Joy came into the shop alone. Another 5 minutes went past, and I said to Joy casually, "Where's Sally?" And Joy said, "I don't know, she was with you." And of course, instant panic. I rushed out into the street, and the street was crowded now because it was 5 o'clock and it was the rush hour. It was a main road. Joy went one way and I went the other. I went down to the corner and found that Sally couldn't have gone that way because there were traffic lights and metal barriers. So I went back and I met Joy and I said, "Have you found her?" And she said, "No." Back I went and I was in a panic. I mean, we'd never been separated from her since she was a baby, since she was born. And here she was, suddenly disappeared. And as I was in this terrible panic, feeling, oh my God, we shall never see her again. She's been kidnapped, she's been murdered, or at least she's wandered under the wheels of a lorry or something. Suddenly, I said to myself, look, stop this. If it takes you until this time tomorrow, you're going to find her. And I really made this terrific mental effort to get my forces under my control again and stop panicking. Then I calmed down, walked around the block, saw that she couldn't have gone that way. I went back, and the second time, Joy fortunately had found her. She'd walked right around the block to the other side, but, hadn't luckily stepped off the pavement. Now, as we got into the car half an hour later, and having sort of spent the time in the bookshop, I drove off with this immense feeling of happiness and relaxation and relief. And I realized I was thinking, my God, aren't buses beautiful objects? And isn't exhaust smoke a lovely smell? And everything seemed to be glowing and alive in a funny sort of way. And we got stuck at one point in a great traffic jam where, the road was being dug up on one side and it was raining. I was still sitting there with the window open, absolutely ecstatically happy. This kind of thing, this kind of experience taught me that the real problem is to do that to the mind. All these diffused emotions spread out all over the place can be gathered together like the billiard balls into the middle of the table. And the experience of driving from Cheltenham down to Bristol in this peculiar state of total ecstasy showed me that it can be maintained. The billiard balls do not spread over the table again. You see, in a funny sense, you spread them over the table. You do it yourself. You think, oh, I'm tired, and let it happen. Whereas if you don't deliberately, as it were, push them apart, it doesn't happen. They stay there in the middle. It's the recognition that our minds are so immensely powerful that we don't even begin to recognize their powers. That phrase in Hindu mythology, the mind is the slayer of the real, the slayer of reality. It's true. These immensely powerful negative forces in our minds can destroy everything simply because we are not aware that they are not objective, they are purely subjective. They're due to upside downness. Now, as this recognition began to come to me, I began to see that I was onto something of tremendous importance. We don't need drugs, we don't need alcohol, we don't need anything else to induce the peak experience. All you need to do is that. We have the power inside us, and the power to do the most peculiar and extraordinary things. I mean, for example, 2 days ago, I was talking about this to a friend in Milwaukee, the last place I was in, and he was saying, he said, look, do you mind if I tell you an out-of-the-body experience of my wife's? And I said, no, please. He said, well, what happened was that Susan had gone to New York. He said, and my brother moved into the apartment with me in Milwaukee. He said, we were sitting there watching television. He said, and suddenly I looked over my shoulder, and my brother said, why did you do that? And he said, I could have sworn Susan came into the room behind me. At this moment, he said, the phone rang, and it was Susan in tears, saying, look, did you just see me come into the apartment behind you? She said, you looked over your shoulder and completely broke my concentration. She said, I was sitting there on the floor listening to this music, but feeling very sad at being away from home, and quite suddenly, as I was visualizing the apartment, there I was, standing behind you. Now, this kind of thing happens again and again and again. We obviously have this peculiar power to do it when we want to, and sometimes we don't even know that we've done it. W.B. Yeats was thinking about some student to whom he was due to deliver a message, and the student, who was 200 miles away, actually saw Yeats walk into the room and talk to him, and then disappear. It's in Yeats's autobiography. We all have these peculiar and extraordinary powers of our minds. The more I've studied the paranormal, the more I've seen that we possess these powers and that everybody has them. You know, the oddest thing of all is precognition, looking into the future. This is the strangest power we possess of all. And yet, the number of cases I've accumulated, you know, just talking to people personally and then checking up on the experiences. You know, there's not much you can do because they're all hearsay, but in the case, for example, of the one I've just told you, I was able to speak to Susie as well and then get them both to write the experience down. And this is all you can do, try to cross-check as far as you can. And in many such cases, you discover, you know, that it really does gel, and what's more, it gels with other cases that you've heard, and you begin to realize that all of us, without exception, possess these extraordinary powers. Why then don't we use them? Simply because we're unaware. Actually, we are aware. Under crisis, we know how to do it. We push the right button and something happens. And just as under crisis you can do the most amazing things, do you remember Hemingway in a story called Soldier's Home talks about how the soldier comes back to his hometown after the war and begins talking about his experiences and somehow feels that people don't believe them, and he himself ceases to believe them even though they're true. He says, those moments when under crisis you did the one thing, the only thing, and it always came out right. Under crisis, we suddenly know what to do, and that's because we've got 2 rows of billiard balls instead of the billiard balls spread all over the tabletop. Get 3 rows of billiard balls, and you would never let go. You would never again spread over the tabletop. Now, this, it seems to me, but by the way, when do I have to stop? Well, the trouble is, if I go on, I keep on till midnight. It's 9. So what time would you like me to stop? All right. Well, if you can bear that much longer, yeah. You see, in 1973, I got a letter from an American doctor called Howard Miller, who lives in New Jersey. Miller told me that he'd reached some extraordinary conclusions about the human mind. One of his patients was terrified of being injected at the dentist, and so she could never have teeth out or drilled. Then she saw in a newspaper that a hypnotist could do it. So Miller took her along to the hypnotist, and the hypnotist placed her under hypnosis with no problem at all. Then the hypnotist said to her, what is more, when I pulled your tooth out, you will not bleed. Miller thought, oh no, that's absurd. I can see that he could stop her feeling pain, because that's subjective, but stop her bleeding. Anyway, the tooth came out, not a drop of blood. So Miller was very puzzled by this, and he started trying to use hypnosis on his own patients. And he found that using it on cancer patients, he was getting the most incredible remissions. And he found himself asking, why? What does hypnosis do? Now, I'd already worked this out for myself. What hypnosis does is perfectly simple. It puts you to sleep and leaves Stan wide awake. All that happens, you see, is under hypnosis, the hypnotist says, okay, you're going into a deep sleep. Ollie closes his eyes and goes right off. Stan remains wide awake. And the hypnotist then says, for example, okay, you're going to lie between two chairs with your head on that chair and your heels on that one. 3 strong men are going to jump up and down on your stomach, and you will not bend in the middle. And Stan says, yes, sir. And does it with no problem at all. So, why won't Stan do it when you tell him to? Because he doesn't believe you. He knows that you're weak and vague and that you don't really mean it. Now, obviously, the problem is quite simple, isn't it? If you, Ollie, could tell Stan with sufficient authority you're going to do that, he would do it for you. Now, here you see, D.H. Lawrence and Henry Miller and Walt Whitman and all the rest were talking about our deep instinctive forces, our intuitions, and that our reason is the villain of the piece and we should ignore it. Yet you can see that, in fact, if you, the rational you, gave this order, Stan would obey. Now, Howard Miller said that he got so fascinated by this problem that he'd said, which part of the brain responds to the hypnotic order? And the more he thought about it, the more he came to this absurd conclusion, just the ordinary cerebral hemispheres, the human bit on top. The you, the ordinary, everyday, left brain you. Now, this struck him as so absurd that he began to really think about it, and he said he came to the conclusion that we are, in a sense, completely unaware of the peculiar power we possess of focusing and concentrating. He said, for example, think of yourself lying on a beach on a marvelous hot day with the sun beating gently down on you, the sound of waves splashing, you can feel the sand against your fingertips, you can feel it against your heels. He said, okay, now shift that. Imagine that you're on a freezing cold day on a mountain slope, there's snow, hard-packed snow on the ground, the branches of a fir tree over your head are covered with snow, you can feel the cold wind against your cheeks and it's a bit painful, but you're still enjoying it and it's not getting through your thick gloves. He said, what inside your head did that switch from the beach to the mountain? He said, think about that. In a sense, it's you. He went on to say, it's almost as if normally we do not believe that our minds have any powers. A tune gets stuck in your head for a whole day and you can't get rid of the bloody thing. And if you can't even get rid of a tune, what kind of powers do our minds have? But he said, it's as if you're sitting in a cinema watching the film and thinking, oh my God, what a bloody mess. It's upside down, the reels are being shown in the wrong order. What on earth has happened to the projectionist? So you go up to the projection box and it's empty. And then suddenly you remember, you are the projectionist. Now, when I read this paper of Howard Miller's, I was fascinated by it. But at the same time, I wrote back to him and said, look, this is fascinating, but do you realize that a European philosopher called Edmund Husserl discovered all this at the beginning of the century? He called it intentionality. It's the fact that whenever you look at something, you fire your attention at it exactly as if firing an arrow at a target. For example, you look at your watch, and if you look at it without focusing, without reaching out and grabbing the time, you don't see the time. You have to look a second time to see what time it is. You have to fire your attention at it, and Husserl called this intentionality and said all consciousness is intentional. There is no mental act that is not intentional. And I said to Miller, what you've said is very interesting, but you've really rediscovered Husserl's intentionality and the fact that he said that up above human consciousness there is a real you, which he called the transcendental ego, borrowing Kant's term. Anyway, Howard Miller was obviously very disappointed by this reply.